6 days before the festival of Passover, Jesus and his disciples went to stay with some friends. They were served a special meal, and while they relaxed around the table, a woman opened a jar of expensive, perfumed oil. She knelt down and rubbed the oil onto Jesus' head. "You could have sold that and given the money to the poor," snapped Judas, one of Jesus' disciples. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "She is being kind." But Judas felt angry with Jesus, and his anger allowed evil to creep into his heart. He knew that the chief priests didn't like Jesus, and he decided to help them get rid of him. 2 days before Passover, he met with them and agreed to lead them to Jesus when Jesus was alone. "I will kiss Jesus to show the guards who to arrest," he told the priests. In return, the priests promised to pay Judas 30 pieces of silver. Jesus knew that the priests were plotting against him. He also knew that it was all part of God's plan, and that he would leave the world soon to join his Father in heaven. But he still felt sad when he thought about what was going to happen. The evening before Passover, Jesus took some water and knelt in front of each of the 12 disciples in turn. He gently washed their feet and dried them with a towel. "Lord, you should not wash our feet," said the disciples. "You are too important." "No one is more important than anyone else," Jesus said. "Even though I am your teacher, we are all equal because we are all God's children." On the day of the Passover, Jesus and his disciples sat down to eat a special meal together. "Soon, one of you will betray me," Jesus told them. The disciples were shocked, all except Judas. "Who is it?" they asked. They didn't notice Judas turning pale. But Jesus would not speak Judas's name. He blessed the bread by saying a prayer, then broke it into pieces and handed it to his disciples. "Like this bread, my body will be broken," he said. "Please eat it." He blessed the wine and passed around the cup so they could all drink from it, to show they were part of God's family. "This wine is like my blood, which will be spilled for many people," he said. "Please drink it." As they ate and drank, Jesus watched his disciples with sadness in his heart. "Eat and drink to remember me," he said. "We won't have another meal together until we are in God's kingdom." There was a quiet garden called Gethsemane, where Jesus liked to pray. After the meal, he took Peter, James, and John there to pray with him. While they rested, Jesus fell on his knees to pray. He knew that the priests were coming for him, and he felt afraid. "Father, I know what needs to happen, but it's going to be very hard," he said. "Please help me." Jesus spoke to God for a long time, and his disciples fell asleep. Soon, Judas entered the garden. Judas was followed by men armed with swords and fiery torches. "Rise," Jesus called. "Here comes the traitor." Peter, James, and John rose quickly, but it was too late. Judas walked up to Jesus and kissed his cheek. It was his signal to the guards that this was the man to arrest. The guards grabbed Jesus by the arms and held him tightly. Peter wanted to fight, but Judas stopped him. "My Father in heaven will protect me," he said. The chief priests took Jesus to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The Romans were in charge of Jerusalem, so it was Pilate's job to decide what would happen to prisoners. Pilate questioned Jesus, trying to find out if Jesus was an enemy of Rome. He knew that the chief priests wanted Jesus dead, but he believed Jesus was harmless. Early the next morning, a large crowd had gathered. "Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" Pilate asked them. The chief priests had already talked to the crowd and told them lies about Jesus. "No," the people shouted. "Crucify him." "Why?" Pilate asked. "What crime has he committed?" But the crowd just kept shouting, "Crucify him." Pilate was a weak man, and he wanted to please the people, so he had Jesus beaten and then handed him over to be crucified. The soldiers dressed Jesus in a purple robe to make fun of him. Purple was the color that kings wore, and they thought he had been pretending to be a king. They wanted to mock him and laugh at him. They even twisted together some thorns to make a crown. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they shouted and laughed at him. Jesus was forced to carry a heavy wooden cross across the crowded city streets. All the way, people jeered and shouted at him. It was very different from the way he had arrived in Jerusalem. At 9 o'clock in the morning, the soldiers nailed Jesus to the cross. "Father, forgive them," he whispered. "They don't understand what they're doing." The minutes crept by like hours, and Jesus was in great pain. It became harder and harder for him to breathe. A crowd gathered, shouted nasty things at Jesus, and made fun of him. "If you were really the Son of God, you would save yourself," they jeered. "Come down from the cross." Jesus did not reply. He felt as if each breath was tearing at his body. The sun shrank away, and the sky became dark and stormy, but the crowd and the priests kept shouting their cruel words. Finally, at 3 o'clock, with a loud cry, the Son of God took his last breath. Later that day, a Roman named Joseph took down Jesus' body and wrapped it in linen and placed it in a tomb. Then he rolled a large, heavy stone over the entrance. Although this is our end for today, we know that this is not the end of the story. And that is why it is called Good Friday, because despite what happened, we know the good that has come from it. The good being our salvation in Jesus Christ.